Hey guys, tonight we're going to settle in for one of those quiet corners of history that doesn't usually get the spotlight. The lives of women who became brides. After a war, and I don't mean the fairy tale kind of wedding, there were no flower crowns, no happily ever after endings. These were the brides taken by conquerors, handed over as part of a peace treaty, captured in raids, or simply absorbed into the new ruling family. So, grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let's start our slow drift back into the past. Because tonight's story isn't about battles or kings or dates you'd have to memorize in school. It's about what came after the battles. The quiet, uncomfortable, often forgotten lives of the women who had to marry the men who just burned their homes down. The concept of the war bride. The idea of taking women after war is almost as old as war itself. Ancient chroniclers wrote about it casually, as if it was just another line item after looting the cattle and melting down the gold. You lose a war, you lose your freedom, and sometimes you lose your daughter to the man with the biggest sword. And for the conquerors, this wasn't just about romance. It was politics. It was about producing heirs, cementing control and symbolically saying, "We own you now." So let's drift through some examples. From the wild Viking Age to the Mongol Empire to medieval Europe, and meet the women who lived through all of this. The Viking love story. Axe first, wedding later. Let's start with the Vikings. Because of course we are. Vikings were equal opportunity raiders. They wanted silver, slaves, and, yes, wives. When they raided a village, they often took young women back home. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in burials. Women with foreign-style jewelry buried alongside Viking men, suggesting they weren't Scandinavian by birth. Some of these women were treated like full wives and given decent burials. Others, not so much. Some were buried outside the main cemetery, which might have been a polite Viking way of saying, "You lived here, but you weren't one of us." And you can almost picture the awkward family dinners. The proud Viking husband telling his raid story for the 100th time, while the wife sits there thinking, "Yeah, I remember. You burned my house down." Very romantic. The Mongol method. Wives as empire-building tools. Fast forward a few centuries to the Mongol Empire. The Mongols didn't just raid, they absorbed. When Genghis Khan conquered a city, he didn't just leave behind a pile of ashes. He often took the daughters of local rulers and married them into his own family. It was a way of claiming not just the territory, but the bloodline. And honestly, it worked. Within a generation, you'd have a whole new ruling class that was part Mongol and part local, which made it harder for the conquered people to rebel. Of course, this also meant that some unlucky princesses ended up as political prizes. They were given new names, new clothes, and often new religions, and that was that. Imagine being a Persian noblewoman one week and a Mongol queen the next. And then imagine having to smile about it, because if you didn't, things could get very unpleasant very quickly. Medieval Europe. Marriage as a treaty. Now let's float over to medieval Europe, where war brides were an official diplomatic tool. If a king conquered your lands, he might demand that your princess marry him. Not because he was looking for love, but because it looked good on paper. Two families united, peace secured. Take Isabella of Angoulême, for example. She was 12 when King John of England decided to marry her, despite the fact that she was already betrothed to another nobleman. John basically broke the engagement by force, married her, and started a war with her would-be groom's family in the process. And poor Isabella had to spend the next 2 decades stuck with John, who, if we're being honest, was not exactly England's best king. He was paranoid, cruel, and really good at losing wars. Eventually, after John died, Isabella went back to France, remarried, and finally got a bit of freedom. But that first marriage set the tone for her entire life. The Ottoman harem, a different kind of captivity. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, captured brides were brought into the imperial harem, which was less of a sexy palace and more like a very elaborate, very political boarding school. Women in the harem were educated, trained in court etiquette, and sometimes married off to governors or generals. But a select few, the lucky or clever ones, caught the Sultan's attention and rose to power. One of the most famous was Hurrem Sultan, also known as Roxolana, who started life as a captured girl from what is now Ukraine. She became Suleiman the Magnificent's favorite, then his legal wife, then basically the co-ruler of the empire. So yes, sometimes being a war bride was the first step to running an empire. But most of the other women in the harem never saw the outside world again. The emotional side, we don't hear about history, rarely tells us how these women actually felt. We get dates, treaties, birth records, but no one bothers to write down if the bride cried on her wedding night, or if she secretly hated her new husband until the day she died. But every now and then, we get a clue. Like Princess Olga of Kiev, who after her husband was murdered, pretended to agree to marry his killers, and then had them burned alive in a bathhouse. That is not exactly a healthy coping mechanism, but it does tell us that these women sometimes held on to their anger for a very long time. Most didn't get to take revenge. Most just lived quietly, raised children, and slowly disappeared into the background of history. Welcome back, everyone. If you're still awake, or if you just woke up and restarted the video, let's keep wandering through the quiet aftermath of war. Because the thing about war brides is that their story doesn't end when the wedding happens. That's really just the start. So tonight, let's drift into the daily life side of things. What it was like to wake up day after day in a stranger's household, living a life you never chose. Learning the language first problem, the language barrier. If you were taken from your village by raiders, chances are you didn't speak a word of their language. And yet, now you had to ask for food, or try to explain why you were crying, or negotiate with the other wives in the house for who got to use the cooking fire. Some women adapted quickly. Others probably spent months in total silence. Historians have found letters and chronicles describing captured brides who eventually became interpreters for their new husbands, which must have been both useful and deeply frustrating. Imagine having to translate while your husband negotiates with people from your old home. Food, clothing, and culture shock. Then there's the issue of food. You grew up eating bread and cheese. Now you're eating boiled horse meat and fermented milk because, congratulations, you live with nomads now. Even the utensils could be confusing. Some cultures used spoons, some used chopsticks, some just used their hands. And if you got it wrong, you'd look like the outsider you were. Clothing was another constant reminder that your life had changed. In many cultures, captured brides were immediately dressed in the style of their new community, which might have felt like a costume at first, and there was no comfort shopping to make yourself feel better. No ordering a piece of jewelry that reminded you of home. You just wore whatever they gave you and hoped it wasn't itchy. Status in the household, your status, depended a lot on who captured you. If you were taken by a farmer or low-ranking soldier, you might be doing hard labor in the fields the next day. If you were taken by a king, you might be seated at the high table, but still under constant watch. And if your new husband already had a wife, well, that could get awkward fast. There are records of households where the first wife bullied the new war bride relentlessly. There are also cases where the new wife became the favorite and pushed the first wife aside, which, I'm sure, made dinner conversations so much fun. Children of two worlds, and then there were the children. In most cases, producing children was the entire point of these marriages. You were there to make sure your conqueror had heirs, and preferably sons. But what happened next depended on the culture. Some children of war brides were raised as full members of the family. Others were marked as mixed blood and treated differently. In medieval Europe, it could get legally complicated. If your mother was captured in war, but you were born after a proper marriage, you might still be considered legitimate. If you were born before the marriage was official, too bad, you were stuck with the label of illegitimacy for life. And that label followed you everywhere. Some kids had to petition the Pope just to be allowed to inherit their father's land. Emotional survival. And here's the part that keeps me up at night. How did these women feel? Because, let's be honest, a lot of them must have been deeply lonely. They had lost their families, their friends, their entire support system. Some coped by blending in completely, converting to the new religion, learning the language, raising their children as if the past didn't exist. Others quietly held on to little pieces of home. They taught their kids words from their first language. They kept small rituals alive in secret, like lighting candles for old gods or whispering prayers from their childhood. And some resisted outright. There are chronicles of women who tried to escape, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. There are also rare cases of women who poisoned their new husbands, though those stories tend to be told with a lot of dramatic flair by the chroniclers, so who knows if they're true when the war starts again. Of course, just because you married into the enemy family didn't mean the war was actually over forever. Sometimes fighting broke out again, and you were suddenly stuck in a terrible position. Do you side with your husband's people or your own? Some women acted as secret informants, sending messages back to their relatives. Others stayed loyal to their new families, even fighting against their old ones. And in the worst cases, they were killed as traitors, no matter which side they chose. The ones who rose to power, but not all war brides were powerless. Some managed to turn their situation to their advantage, becoming queens, regents, or even rulers in their own right. Roxolana, whom we mentioned earlier, became so powerful that she broke centuries of Ottoman tradition by becoming the Sultan's legal wife. In medieval Spain, Berenguela of Castile turned her arranged marriage into a political weapon, eventually securing the throne for her son and uniting Castile and Leon. So yes, while most war brides lived quiet, forgotten lives, a few used their position to rewrite history. A quiet legacy end. It brings us to maybe the strangest part of this story. The fact that so many of us are probably descended from these forgotten women. Genetic studies show huge population shifts after major conquests, from the Viking Age, from the Mongol Empire, from every major war that involved mass relocation. So somewhere in your family tree, there might be a woman whose life was completely overturned by war, and who somehow carried on anyway. And that's something worth remembering. All right? We're still here, still in that quiet space. If you've got a blanket nearby, now is the time to pull it a little tighter. Because tonight, we're moving from the general to the particular, drifting through a few lives where we actually know the names and fates of these so-called war brides. The Viking bride who became Danish. Royalty, let's start in the Viking Age. Now, Vikings had a bit of a reputation for, well, raiding. That was kind of their thing. But they also took women as wives or concubines during these raids, especially in the British Isles. One of the more famous cases was a woman named Gytha Thorkelsdóttir. She wasn't exactly captured, more like strategically married off. Her family had been caught up in the endless cycle of raids and alliances between Scandinavia and England, and marrying her to a Danish noble was the solution. She ended up being the mother of King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. Which is funny, because Harold was killed by Normans, who were basically Viking descendants. So Gytha's story shows how quickly a captured or arranged bride could rise, and how tangled those family trees became. The Byzantine princess, who became a pawn lets float over to the Byzantine Empire, where royal daughters were often married off to keep the peace. One such princess was Anna Porphyrogenita. She was married to Vladimir of Kiev, the guy who Christianized all of Kievan Rus, and she didn't have much choice in the matter. The marriage was part of a deal. Vladimir would get a Byzantine bride if he converted to Christianity and baptized his people. So, Anna left Constantinople, the most glittering, sophisticated city of its day, and went to live in Kiev, which, by all accounts, was a little rougher around the edges. Imagine going from marble palaces to wooden fortresses and mud streets. She probably introduced a ton of Byzantine court culture to Kiev, but we don't have her diary, so we'll never know if she cried herself to sleep or just got on with it. The Mongol princess who got traded, like a chess piece. Now let's ride across the steppe and talk about a Mongol bride. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was big on marrying off his daughters to keep the empire stitched together. One of his daughters, whose name was probably Nomakhan or something very close, sources vary, was married to a Persian prince. It wasn't exactly a romantic union. It was a political move to keep the Ilkhanate loyal to the great Khan in Mongolia. She had to leave the Mongol court, travel thousands of miles, and settle in a culture that looked nothing like the one she grew up in. Most of these princesses were expected to act as informal ambassadors, reminding their husbands where their loyalties were supposed to be, which must have been stressful if your new husband didn't want to listen. The Norman lady who married her enemy. And now we'll pause in Norman England. After the conquest of 1066, many Anglo-Saxon noblewomen were forcibly married to Norman knights after William the Conqueror took over. This was partly about consolidating power. You marry the lady, you get her lands. One such woman was Edith of Mercia, who was forced to marry a Norman lord to keep her family estates. She went from being part of the Old English ruling class to basically a hostage in her own home. Some of these women became loyal Norman wives. Others quietly kept supporting English rebellions. Edith's fate isn't completely known, but the pattern is clear. Forced marriage was the tool that kept rebellions from flaring up too fast. The Spanish captives of the Reconquista. We can't forget Spain, where Christian and Muslim kingdoms were constantly at war. Women were captured, married off, and converted to whichever faith was in charge at the moment. One well-known case was Isabella of Portugal, who was captured as a child and raised in the court of Granada before being returned to her family and married off to strengthen alliances. She spent years caught between two worlds, fluent in Arabic, educated in Muslim customs, but ultimately married into a Christian royal house. It's an eerie reminder that these women often became cultural bridges, whether they wanted to or not. Quiet lives, loud legacies, and as we look at all these stories side by side, we start to notice something. None of these women chose their circumstances, but they shaped the world anyway. They raised children who became kings, queens, and emperors. They influenced court fashions. They brought ideas, foods, and languages across borders. And even if they never set foot in a battlefield, they were the reason wars could end, or at least pause long enough for the next generation to be born. Welcome back, Night Owls. If you've made it this far, you might be wondering, what if these war bride arrangements went wrong? Well, they often did, because marrying your enemy isn't exactly the recipe for a stress-free relationship. The brides who got rejected. Some brides were simply sent home. In medieval chronicles, we see cases where political alliances broke down, and the bride was quietly packed off to a monastery or sent back to her family with a polite note. It was humiliating, of course, but also practical. If the alliance no longer served a purpose, keeping her around just complicated things. A famous example is Isabella of Gloucester, who was married to King John of England. She wasn't technically a war bride, but her marriage was very much a political arrangement. John eventually had their marriage annulled so he could try to marry someone with more land and power. Isabella was left with her title but no real influence. A very public reminder that royal marriage was just another tool in the political toolbox. The ones who were exchanged, like property in other cases, brides were actually traded. During the Crusades, captured noblewomen were sometimes ransomed back to their families, which sounds nice, except that it was basically a business transaction. One chronicler describes a deal where a captured Muslim princess was exchanged for a group of Christian prisoners. Imagine being part of that swap, standing there while both sides counted whether the trade was fair. For the woman involved, it must have felt like being tossed back and forth between two worlds. The second marriage problem. Another common fate was remarriage. If a war bride's husband died, in battle, of plague, or just from bad luck, she was often quickly remarried to someone else. Widowhood was a dangerous status in the medieval world. Too much independence could make the family nervous. So, most widows were placed in new marriages, whether they wanted to be or not. This created endless legal headaches about dowries, inheritances, and which children had claims to which property. Medieval courts were full of cases about this, proving that even 800 years ago, lawyers stayed busy. The ones who ran away, and then there are the women who simply left. Every so often, a chronicle mentions a bride who escaped her new life and made her way back to her family. These are rare cases, and we usually don't know if she lived happily ever after or just got forced into a new marriage. One Scandinavian saga tells of a woman who fled her Viking captor, traveled across several kingdoms, and was eventually ransomed by her brothers. Whether the story is true or just a bit of poetic license, it shows that at least some of these women fought to regain control over their lives. Emotional fallout even. When these marriages worked, the emotional toll was probably enormous. Imagine living for decades with someone who once led the raid that killed half your village. Imagine smiling through banquets with the people who burned your home. This quiet, invisible suffering is almost never mentioned in chronicles, but it had to be there. Historians sometimes find clues, like donations to monasteries in the woman's name, maybe as a form of penance, or inscriptions asking for prayers for her soul. It's a reminder that survival wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. Cultural erasure. And finally, we should talk about identity. Many of these women were absorbed so completely into their new culture that their original names, languages, and religions disappeared from the record. A woman born as Helga in Norway might end her life as Edgyth in England, remembered only as the Lady of such and such manor. Their children rarely carried on their mother's native traditions, which means entire cultural connections were quietly erased within a generation or two, and yet those children kept the bloodline alive, tying together two enemy peoples in a way that could never fully be undone. Quiet resilience. The common thread through all of this is resilience. These women didn't get to choose the wars, the politics, or the alliances that shaped their lives. But they endured. Sometimes they became queens. Sometimes they vanished into obscurity. But they were always part of the story. The glue that held dynasties together after the swords were put away. All right, friends. We've wandered through raids and households, through queens and concubines, through women who adapted and those who escaped. Now, let's let it all settle into a quieter reflection. The invisible architects of peace. When we talk about history, we usually focus on the conquerors, the men who swung swords, signed treaties, or rode into battle shouting about destiny. But really, once the dust settled, who was left to glue society back together? It was the women who suddenly found themselves married into the enemy's household. They had no parades, no monuments, but they were the ones smoothing tensions over the dinner table, teaching their children not to stab each other and making sure alliances actually stuck. No chronicler ever wrote, "And peace lasted 20 years because the queen tolerated her husband's bad table, manners." But maybe they should have. Generational ripples. Every child born from these marriages carried more than just bloodlines. They carried political meaning. A son born of a captured bride might inherit 2 kingdoms, whether he wanted them or not. A daughter might be used for yet another marriage alliance, pushing the cycle forward. And centuries later, when we look at the tangled family trees of Europe or Asia, we find these marriages everywhere. Vikings mixed with Anglo-Saxons, Byzantines with Slavs, Mongols with Persians. If you've ever taken one of those DNA ancestry tests and been surprised at the results, well, now you know why. Some forgotten war bride in the 12th century probably explains the weird percentages. The ones history forgot, of course. Most of these women left no record. We know the names of queens and princesses, but the thousands of unnamed women who were taken during raids, they're silent. They became farm wives, servants, mothers of children who never knew their mother's original language. They disappeared into history so completely that the only evidence we have is the genetic trail left in their descendants. And there's something both sad and strangely peaceful about that. Resilience. Without recognition, it's easy to see them as victims. And they were, but they were also survivors. They found ways to keep going. To laugh, probably, at least sometimes. To raise children who would outlive the chaos. And even if their stories weren't written down, their existence shaped the world we live in now. Think about it. Without these marriages, many dynasties wouldn't exist. Borders would look different. Entire cultures might have taken other paths, all because someone lit a candle in a dark, unfamiliar house and decided to keep living. A gentle closing thought, so as we drift toward the end of tonight's story, maybe it's worth pausing to imagine them. The nameless bride carried off in a Viking longship, rocking on the waves in silence. The Byzantine princess stepping off a boat in Kiev, clutching a cloak she'd never wear again. The Mongol girl staring out at mountains she didn't recognize. All of them part of history's quiet undercurrent. The peace after the war. They don't have epic songs. They don't have statues. But they're there, woven into the fabric of who we are. And breathe all right. That's where we'll leave it tonight. If you've made it to the end, you've floated through centuries of forgotten brides, strange alliances, and quiet endurance. Maybe you're still awake. Maybe you've already drifted off somewhere around the Byzantines. Either way, that's the point. So close your eyes, let the story fade, and remember, history isn't just battles and kings. Sometimes it's the quiet survival of people whose names we'll never know. Good night, and sleep well.